Well, we are so grateful for Laurie Kraus to be here, Director of Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, which deals with issues across the world, not only in our country, but in countries across the world. I can't imagine what it's like to watch the news and say, oh my goodness, my job just got more complicated because there's another disaster someplace, another issue to have to deal with. But Laurie does it incredibly well, and it represents this whole idea that we as Presbyterians reach out in the world and help those who are in need and suffering. And so without further delay, Laurie, welcome to this church, welcome to this class.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry about that. I do get chatting. And where do I need to be? Right here so that you guys can see me. Hi, Zoom land. Perfect. Okay. So I guess what I'd like to do is give you a kind of a quick high overview of some of the things we're working on, and then let you say, hey, what are you doing here? Or what are we doing there? Or what about this other project that we're working on? Are you doing anything on that? Is that okay? Because I really want to tend to what you're interested in more. So Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, which I'm just going to call PDA from now on, is part of the One Great Hour of Sharing family of programs. I know this congregation takes One Great Hour of Sharing. So we are a sister program, a sibling program to the Presbyterian Hunger Program, which does development and anti-poverty work, and Presbyterian Self-Development of People, which started as the Presbyterian Church's effort to understand and relate to reparations, and has kind of broadened into some other arenas, but their core activity is to find communities that have been excluded structurally or overlooked, and to center the ability to find resources on self-starting opportunities that those communities want to do for themselves in order to achieve equity and sort of self-determination. They do that mostly in the US and secondarily in just a few countries. So we work in that family of offices, and our core funding comes from One Great Hour of Sharing, and then PDA kind of a lot larger than the other two for reasons of constant disasters. Also occasionally has appeals and has some folks basically, and including this congregation, who give annually and on a regular basis, both just to support our general work and also specific pieces. And probably some of you know this congregation has been very generous, and we've received around $20,000 just from your congregation and the inventive art and intersectional sort of gatherings you've done to raise money to support people in Ukraine and fleeing Ukraine. So I thank you for that. Okay, so then what we do, PDA, is in roughly 4 divisions. The first division is domestic disaster response. We do that the way we do our international work, which is we don't come in and do stuff to and for people. We come in relationship first with the presbytery and with congregations that may have been impacted or who are doing work for that particular event. And we provide resources and coaching and accompaniment. Bob Barnes here and I both were a part of this program, the domestic program, for about 15, 20 years as volunteers who left off our day jobs to go to places that had had disasters, and kind of to help coach people through the landscape of disaster, which is really crazy. And if you've never been in a major disaster, all of the initials and people who come, and it's very hard to figure out what they do and what you should do and how to focus your attention and your resources on the thing that's going to make the most difference. So part of what our domestic program does with our volunteers, and the team had about 30 when Bob and I were on it, it has about 80 people now, is to sort of keep a company, not just when the disaster happens, but to stay through the long haul. That's a hallmark of PDA, that as much as we're able, we stay until the disaster is repaired and the community has been made whole again. Increasingly, we're trying really hard to unite with long-term recovery that also attends to mitigation, because climate is increasingly a huge agitator of disaster. I don't have to tell you, you've just watched half of your mountains burn up in the last 2 months. You've never had a disaster like that in the state before. Climate, the drought that you're under, absolutely affects and continues to deepen the effect of disasters in the Gulf Coast, in Florida, all along the hurricane field. That's where I'm from, Miami. The severity, the flooding, the seawater rise, the loss of land, and the intensity of these storms and the frequency of these storms has increased year by year by year. And that's climate related, you can't evade it. So increasingly what we're trying to do with our long-term recovery is pay attention to mitigation for the future, to the effects of climate, to the effects of advocacy issues that would make disaster recovery better for people who often get left out of disaster recovery. This is going to be really important in the Hermit's Peak and Calf Canyon and the other fire, because there's a lot of small communities, historic Native communities and Hispanic communities that have been here for centuries, many of whom have property that they can't prove they own, many of whom are off the grid for various reasons, many of whom have really good reasons not to trust government. And so when FEMA comes in and says, here's the way we do our paperwork, and here's how you can get money from us, this is going to be very difficult for a number of people. And so we met on Thursday with the Presbyterian, a representative of the Presbyterian communities up and down the corridor there. And many of them have also experienced losses, but also we're saying La Gente in the Valley, they also have experienced losses, and we know they don't come to speak up for themselves. So we want to pay attention to them. So part of what we promised the Presbytery yesterday was when PDA brings in these resources and when we try to help equip the Presbyterians and the interfaith community in the region to do the response for themselves, one of the things we want to pay attention to is historical exclusion. And we want to pay attention to the vulnerability of climate. And we want to pay attention to being a voice of advocacy for the systems and structures, FEMA and others in the government, who don't have metrics to invite and to accompany these kinds of communities, which are so important to the culture and the humanity of northern New Mexico. So multiply that globally and across the United States. That's how we try to do our work. It's what we try to pay attention to. Our call is to serve the most vulnerable and to center the affected community to do what they're doing. So currently, we're working here. We're working fires in the Pacific Northwest and Colorado. We are still in the middle of a lot of hurricane response along the Gulf Coast. 2020 was a terrible year for the Gulf Coast for hurricanes and also for Central America. We have a bunch of tornadoes, very out of season. If you know, again, all the disasters are going to be out of season pretty soon. Massive out of season and weird location tornadoes 2 hours south of where I live in Kentucky that wiped out towns, full towns. A tornado that stayed on the ground for 200 miles, almost unprecedented. Although Bob says it happens out here all the time, but nobody knows because nobody lives there. So that probably is true. So, so domestically, we're doing hurricane work, flood work, fire work, and we also do human-caused disaster in the United States, which means that we respond to incidents of mass violence. So we have been, it's a way that I feel particularly connected to this congregation, frankly, because of the work you do with Guns to Gardens and the work you do with gun violence advocacy, reduction advocacy. Bob and I both were sort of founding parts of the team for PDA that figured out that human-caused violence, mass violence events are a disaster, but they're a different kind of disaster. You can't go in and treat them in the same way because they require a lot of systemic advocacy. They require trauma skills at a much greater level and depth. And they are in many ways, 1 week after the event, a completely invisible disaster to everybody who wasn't there. We know because just in April and May and June and July of this year, we've had more mass violence events in this country than ever before in that short of a period of time. We had 30 in that 1 week that Uvalde happened, and we are already nearly at 400 mass violence events for the year, and we're barely in the middle of the year. So that also is increasing. This is unfortunately something that we kind of anticipated was going to happen, that the lockdown sent a lot of people into unhealthy places in their hearts and unhealthy places on the internet, and the political polarization in our country that came before and accompanied the depth of the COVID pandemic really fed people's rage and isolation and sense of exclusion. And we're seeing that in these mass violence events as people decide to just make a name for themselves, or to address what they see as an injustice, or just because they're broken and that's what they need to do. So for those kinds of events, we go in sort of with the trauma skill set on, and we try to help faith communities understand that the length of time it takes to recover from a mass violence event is in some ways even longer than a physical disaster, and that people go quiet and often carry pain in deep places where they don't talk about it. Back in the day, we used to say, well, we're not going to get political and talk about gun violence reduction right when this terrible, unusual thing has happened. But as we've all, I think, lived into mass violence events, we've realized that these things go hand in hand. Our lack of ability to speak up, our lack of willingness to name what it is exacerbating and increasing the number and severity of these events. And so we try to pay really deep attention to hurting communities. We also try to pay deep attention to how hurting communities try to turn their grief into action. And I think many of you in this community have seen our documentary Trigger, the ripple effect of gun violence, which David Barnhart, a colleague of mine, made several years ago. The General Assembly this year passed a very sweeping gun violence prevention action packet that included guns to gardens, the whole denomination picking up guns to gardens, but also included asking PDA to go back and take that documentary, which is about, I think, an hour and 20 minutes, and break it into pieces that can be used sort of in adult ed classes with conversation afterwards, and also to add some additional pieces to it. And I think it was 2018 or 2019, I sent David out here to talk to Harry and to some of you about the work that you were doing in the state of New Mexico. And he did that. And I was just saying to Harry last night that I think as we go back to do this additional piece to Trigger, I'm going to hope that we can find a way to include the work of your congregation in that, and the Guns to Garden project as well as a part of that, because people of faith need to have something tangible they can cling to make a difference and to put their heart into response. So domestically, that's really what we try to do, is bring resources of all sorts into communities after disaster, to mobilize attention of the whole Presbyterian Church and the larger interfaith community to respond to disaster. And based on how many resources we receive for that, we can stay in longer or do more or do additional kinds of things. Of course, we work with the Methodists and the Baptists and all the people to do that together. So that's the domestic program. One more little thing about the domestic program, we do pay attention to spiritual care and attention to faith leaders, because we know that when a disaster afflicts a community, often the faith leaders step up to sort of help organize. And if it's their own community that's affected, they tend to kind of put their own stuff on the side while they respond. I was already seeing this when we were in Mora and Las Vegas, that the pastors and the commissioned lay pastors there are exhausted and worried about their people and not taking care of themselves. So one of the things we try to do is pay attention to faith leaders and help keep them resilient and strong and give them respite so that they can remain healthy in relationship to the work that they're doing with their members and with the larger community. In fact, we yesterday kind of agreed to pick up the Presbyterian is doing a retreat for faith leaders at the end of August. Is that right, Judy? And we basically said to the Committee on Ministry, look, if paying for the retreat is going to be a barrier for anybody, why don't we just cover the whole retreat for all the pastors? And then if people have the means to pay, or their churches were willing to pay, they can donate that to the fire fund for the Presbyterian. So it'll kill two birds with one stone and support two things and make it important for the pastors to go, because they'll be helping the fires and the recovery from that. Internationally, we are working in about 38 countries right now. The response to Ukraine has been overwhelming. We have over $8 million. We did a very minor, basically we had a banner up and we sent an email to every church and to individual donors. And within 3 months, we had over $8 million, which was astounding. We'll be able to stay in that response, both in the countries that are bordering and receiving the millions of refugees, but also in the rebuilding of Ukraine after the war. For many years. This will probably be for us a 5-year response. And the generosity that Presbyterians have shown for this response has been magnified in Europe, across the world. There are many, many, many resources. It is a horrifying catastrophe that for some of us of a certain age evokes other moments with Russia in the past. And I think that's part of why this response has gotten such strong adherence, and it's beautiful and also heartbreaking in a little bit, because for those of you who were at the 8:30 service, I told a story about my colleague in Cameroon. It's very hard to get people to pay attention to Cameroon and what's continuing to go on there, and in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in South Sudan. And I particularly spend a great deal of time in the Middle East. I was just in Lebanon last month. They are now one of the richest countries once upon a time in that part of the Middle East, 80% poverty now in that country, partly because of the war in the region with Syria that has been going on in Syria and continues there. Syria also remains broken and without adequate resources or work for people to recover. And we have kept our church involved with that community for the last 12 years, but it's very challenging to draw people's attention to something that has gone on for so long. So, that's a challenge, to try to balance where people's attention is with the resources that come our way, and then to try to make sure we're equitably providing support, in as many places as we can. We're at work in Africa, in Southern Africa mostly, because of a series of terrible typhoons late last fall and early this year in Madagascar and Malawi and Mozambique. We're still working in South Sudan, which along with several of the bordering countries, Somalia and some other, are going into, have been in drought and have been on the tip of famine and are probably going to be in full-blown famine by later this year. The Ukraine situation, as most of us know, and the grain that's not going to be getting out of that region because of the war is going to cause hardship in a lot of places, but in places in sub-Saharan Africa, it's going to be devastating. And so several of the people who work together in international disaster response, Presbyterian Church is a member of one of these groups called the ACT Alliance, which is 145 faith organizations who do disaster and development and advocacy. We're now basically starting a campaign to address impending famine in the Horn of Africa, trying to sort of rally to get there before the needs are so terrible that there's no way to bring people back from the brink of starvation. Also continuing to work in Tigray and in some places in Asia, as well as throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. Some of that work is more traditional disaster work, floods, earthquakes, and the like. But a lot of that work goes into our third area, which is refugee resettlement, support for immigration, and also support for asylum seekers, which Albuquerque and Santa Fe also have been amazing partners in practicing welcome and in trying to have transitional havens for asylum seekers and people trying to resettle in this country. So we have a staff member and someone who just hired to do not only kind of the direct connection and grant making to communities who are practicing welcome and helping asylum seekers work through the court processes and survive while they're waiting for their chance to make their case for citizenship for receiving asylum. We've also now hired a young lady who is going to be working with communities along the border, and Albuquerque will be one of them actually. So this Presbyterian will be involved, who are putting together interfaith groups so that sort of an ongoing, multifaceted, legal, physical, job, shelter kind of portfolio can wrap around these folks who have fled violence and starvation and many conditions in Latin America, in Haiti and Afghanistan and Ukraine, around the world. We have two big substantive responses locationally going on with the Afghan refugee situation from last fall. A couple of our Presbyterian camps said, hey, we can't have campers now because COVID, but maybe we could host families who are evacuating Afghanistan if there was some way to make that happen. So in Arkansas at Ferncliff Camp, which is a camp that we also sometimes use for healing camps after gun violence for students, and in Massanutten Springs, which is a camp in Virginia, we worked with these two camps, a local Church World Service resettlement organization that was processing Afghan refugees, with two kind of anchor congregations, a Second Pres in Little Rock and I think First Winchester in the Shenandoah Presbyterian, and the Presbyteries. Everybody put in a little bit, we put in a little bit. And so for the last few months, these Afghan families have been able to kind of live together in family relationships and cook for themselves and do normal things for themselves rather than being in a hotel somewhere while they get their feet on the ground and figure out how they're going to make a new life after their world collapsed. So the fourth area is our story ministry. I alluded to it earlier when I was talking about our film Trigger. We also have done a film on environmental racism and the Flint water crisis that also won a lot of documentary awards. Both of those films, Trigger and Flint, are on Amazon Prime, and you can pull them right off of that. So the reach of these films has gone far beyond Presbyterian Sunday school classes, which has been amazing. Trigger, as I said, is going to be expanded. David, our filmmaker, is currently working on a piece, another piece about environmental degradation and racism that's rooted in ethylene oxide poisoning, which is a huge issue that has not gotten a lot of public attention, but is starting to break open as some class action lawsuits are coming forward. And we're working to get people's stories told through this documentary means as well. We're looking forward to doing a climate piece beginning next year so that we'll have that we can share. And we also have a piece that we worked on with the larger church on the impacts of white privilege and racism. It's not really a film as much as it's 4 short films that address racial identity, the doctrine of discovery, which is an enormous thing in this area. June Lorenzo, actually, who's a Laguna and a member of this presbytery, is the primary person we interviewed for the piece on doctrine of discovery. The Asian Americans and internment and that journey, African Americans and the legacy of enslavement, and how we who are not any of those people, but who love and live and serve with those people can examine our own lives and be good allies. So it's a really great teaching piece. We're just kind of pushing it out now. Very different from some of the other pieces we've done, but we were invited to do that, and it was a real privilege. So those are our 4 areas. What are you particularly interested in that I didn't already touch on? Sorry, Gail, I keep stepping to the side.
What is your budget and how does that funnel through the Presbyterian Church in Louisville?
Thank you, that's a good question. So the 3 programs I mentioned that are part of 1 Great Hour of Sharing and the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program, those 4 programs are entirely supported by restricted dollars. So the offerings for those 4 programs are the core budget for all 4 of our programs. We don't receive per capita or undesignated dollars at all. The baseline for that presently, for 1 Great Hour of Sharing, each of the programs gets about, maybe 2.5 million, depending on what the offering was that year. Several of these programs also have funds that people had donated or legacy funds that we can use the interest from, or if we need it, we can take capital from. PDA also, because of the nature of our work, has a lot of ongoing donations that come to just general disasters that people want to respond to globally or in the US. And we have some people called Pillars of the Church who give monthly. So PDA's budget on top of that 2.5, we figure our baseline budget in a low disaster year, and I use that term very advisedly, is around 4.5 million. But we just got 8.5 million in for Ukraine. We're not going to push all that out right away because long-term, you need to have that for the long term. And we got 2 million, yes, 2 million for the tornadoes. So already our 4 million is now up by 12 million. So next year's budget is likely to be more like 6 or 7 million because we'll be starting to program these large-scale disasters out. So yeah, so it's all donation-based, it's all restricted, it stays just within the program that it's given to. The giving catalog, I don't know if you all ever see that, but the giving catalog also, we get a very small amount from that, but that's also restricted dollars that go to those programs as well. So it really kind of depends on what the particular year is, and funds are designated to particular kinds of disasters or to specific disasters. And then other disasters, we just have to program out of people who say, we're going to give it to you wherever you need it the most, because we know a lot of disasters don't get any attention. So next year's budget, I think we're set at about, we were set before Ukraine happened. We did all the budgeting in February for the next 2 years because General Assembly has to approve the whole budget of the mission agency. And so I think we budgeted at about maybe 5.5 and 6.5 for 23 and 24, but now that's going to go up. And PDA is allowed to randomly change its budget because we're a demand organization. The system is pretty flexible with us, which is really good for a structure like a church, an institution.
Is there a way to give to PDA or specifically to the Horn of Africa? Or
Yes.
Middle East?
Yes. So, so you can send a check to, so our general account is 148, is DR 000148. And you can send it to Presbyterian Disaster Assistance 148 or just general, and it will come and we'll put it in that fund and apply it. If you wanted to send something specifically to the Horn of Africa, we have an Africa account, which if you go on the big website, if you go on PDA's website and dig down to the situation pages, you can get that information. You can also just say PDA Horn of Africa, and they're really diligent. The people who receive the funds are really diligent about writing everything. We have a big spreadsheet, and then we put it in the appropriate account. So if we don't, if a donor doesn't know the account or can't figure out how to get through the website, which is often they're supposedly redoing it, but we'll see. PDA's website is pretty easy, but you have to go through the PCUSA website, and that one's a mess. So do PCUSA/PDA, that'll take you to our site, and then you can click on the area and it'll show you how to give to that. But we always put it in the fund where it's meant. Wildfires, that's a fund, hurricanes, that. Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned that you are responding to the psychological trauma of gunshot, gun violence and probably other, and maybe even the psychological trauma of natural disasters. So your volunteers that go in, or do you require that they be trained before they volunteer and go to these sites? Do they need previous certification of trauma training, or do you train them?
Okay, so can you hear the question? Should I repeat the question for y'all? Okay, so the question is, do we require a level of trauma certification or some other kind of certification to be a volunteer for PDA and to go into these places? So the answer is no and yes. A lot of we have a lot of clergy who volunteer who have that in their preparation. We have a lot of lay people who volunteer. Some of them are clinicians, some of them are not. We cover long-term, our volunteers do long-term recovery support, hosting and hospitality, because part of our domestic ministry is bringing in work teams to help do rebuilding. So we have volunteers who help assess developing a host site. And then we have the trauma volunteers. So the trauma volunteers, we first recruit them and have them do broad-based responding that's not trauma specific. If they either have a past skill set or certification or seem to have an aptitude, we'll work with them to sort of develop that. We provide continuing education for our volunteers. We have an annual meeting once a year for a week. We train them in trauma. Last year, we had people looking at historical harm and environmental and systemic racism, because we want them to have the ability to take that lens into a disaster site to help a local community find people who have been excluded. So that's a training piece we've started doing. They sign the same ethics forms that we sign as employees. So we treat them as though they're professional adjuncts, and we train them and maintain that training. Yeah.
And what do you do? Can you say a little more about that annual?
So the question is, how do we do the training? It varies in different places. Twice while I was on the team, we came to Santa Fe for our annual meeting. But we go lots of different places. We bring the whole group in. They spend a week. We have group breakouts. We have experts come in to do training. If people want to become a volunteer, there's a whole discernment process. They fill out an application and then they're invited. We do this about once every 18 months or so. They'll be invited to a 5-day setting where they can work with some of our established volunteers and some of our staff to see whether their instinct that they'd like to do this kind of work is true, and whether they have an aptitude for it, and whether they'll fit into the team and want to do it. So it's a mutual discernment piece, and then we'll invite people to come on the team.
Yesterday at Presbyterian, several of the Presbyterian churches in Albuquerque are receiving 50 asylum seekers, a busload, every other week. Was that right?
Yes.
And they want to wrap it up to 50 busloads every week that are coming up from the border. And they gave a list of things that are needed, and that list I will try to get onto our e-news. But it just, how do you see PDA helping to support that type of project that the churches in Albuquerque are working on?
Could you hear Judy, or should I summarize, Gail? Summarize. Okay. So yesterday at Presbyterian, one of the pastors from Albuquerque talked about, I think it's First Church, but some of the others as well, are every other week hosting 50 asylum seekers who are bussed up from the border after they're processed. And then they stay for a few days or a couple of weeks while they kind of figure out where they're gonna stay and wait for their hearing. Sometimes that the backlog is terrible. It's up to 2 or 3 years of people backlogged in the system right now. And they were saying that they would like to do it every week, have 50 people come every week, but they're gonna need more churches and more donations because they provide clothes and hygiene kits and backpacks and other sorts of resources for people while they're doing that. So Judy was asking, how do we help get this church and other churches involved, and what does PDA come alongside for? So Stephanie, who is the associate pastor of First, I hooked her up before the end of the meeting with our new network builder for the refugee program, and with Susan, who is the head of our refugee program. And basically, they've been using FEMA funds to do the work and to support the work in the church, but they're going to need, and donations, but they're going to need more. So we have grants that we use for community-based refugee welcome and asylum seeker welcome activities. So Stephanie's church would go to the Presbyterian and say, hey, we would like to apply for a refugee grant to help support this ministry. And then we would review that and probably agree to fund it for a year and maybe renew it. We try not to do it perpetually, but we try to do it for a year or 2 or 3. We've got grants like that operating in Pacific Presbyterian, in El Paso area, and in Brownsville area, and also in Tucson and south of Tucson on the border, where there are large concentrations of faith communities cross-border doing this work together. So the one in El Paso, the shelter is actually on the Mexican side. It's Mexican Presbyterians who are running the shelter, but the churches in El Paso, particularly the Presbyterian ones, are also working to support and do the in-processing. And there's also a program in Arizona and in Texas called Courts and Ports, which means that volunteers show up at court hearings for asylum seekers so that the judges know that people are watching and standing beside people who are seeking refuge here in our country, and also help move them from place to place and provide transportation to where folks maybe have family or a place that's willing to host them. So we do that kind of funding. We will probably, they haven't asked yet because they just found out yesterday, but it's likely we'll do that. Also, Church World Service has for years done what they call kits, Gifts of the Heart kits, and they do, and one of our Presbyterian camps PDA built a big warehouse at our Presbyterian camp in Arkansas to host those kits, and we promote the kit making. It's a great kind of congregational, intergenerational activity or youth activity. In my Presbyterian Kentucky, Presbyterian members once a year gather and put these kits together and then send them to Arkansas. General Assembly, Presbyterian Mid-Kentucky's project for General Assembly was collecting the items for, I'm thinking of what I saw there. It must have been hygiene kits because there were a lot of washcloths and toothbrushes in the room. And so all of the people who came, the commissioners who came to General Assembly, brought washcloths, toothpaste, toothbrushes, all of the kind of different things that are in these prescribed kits. And then for refugees, backpacks for kids that have specific things for schooling and for play, hygiene kits. They're starting a kit for women's hygiene because they found that that's a real need. So, and then there's also a flood kit that you would only episodically have to worry about that, but we send a lot of those to the Gulf Coast and to Florida and to the Carolinas after hurricane events. So those kinds of kits we also support, and would reach out and say, we'll talk to CWS or hook you up with Church World Service so that you can get a backlog of these backpacks so you can pass them out to the kids. Yeah.
Say something about who do you partner with to do these projects in terms of the supplies and materials, and how do you get the feedback on the quality of the service and so forth?
So you're talking about the kit projects?
Yeah, things like that.
So the question is about who do we partner with to get the kits? The kind of cool thing about the kits is any church from 10 members or 4 members to 5,000 members can probably get people to go to the dollar store and bring in, you know, a bunch of washcloths. So we don't fund, we work with Church World Service because they administrate the project. Though many of us who've been active in it, many denominations like Lutherans, Methodists, Baptists, the United Church of Christ, and the Disciples of Christ are very active in that particular kind of collaboration. But all of the supplies are basically gathered by local congregation members and children. And you go on the web, our website has lists of the different kits, what goes into each of them, because they want them all to be exactly the same. And then one day you put it in your bulletin, next Saturday, we're having this, bring these things, and we're going to put these kits together and ship them to, I guess it would probably be Arkansas would be the closest one here. So that one's kind of a self-generating project, so we don't have to supply anything for it. We just make sure they get someplace where they can be sent.
We just a quickie, we do that locally with Las Cephas Presbyterian Church, dignity kits that we have done in the past.
Yeah, so yeah, I think there are a lot of great, for people who are living unhoused, I think there are a lot of great local initiatives that are very parallel to this one that's a little more kind of broad-based. So yeah, that's great.
You mentioned respite care for, let's say, leaders. And I was wondering if you have resources on spiritual practices that transform and support people that might not take the whole presbytery. Because there's an assumption that, okay, if you're a church member, you church, that you have the resource, like that financial, but the spiritual resources to discern what you need to do and to sustain yourself as you do them.
Yeah, the question is about, do we have spiritual care, self-care resources and spiritual awareness, discernment resources that we bring to communities and to leaders, but also to the broader community to help them as they practice self-care and also try to make meaning out of things that are happening to them. And we do. That's actually because of the work that Bob and I were doing, particularly with human caused disaster. I noticed in myself a lot of diminishment of satisfaction of life and sense of well-being and sense that I was making a difference. And then when I noticed it in myself, I noticed that all the people that we were meeting with and working with were having it as well. So we developed an instrument in companionship with actually a traumatologist that's compassion fatigue. And it's not traditionally a spiritual Christian resource, but it is a spiritual it's physiological and spiritual practices to keep you healthy in that. We bring that, sometimes it's a retreat, sometimes it's a 6 or 3 hour workshop into communities. And then people can integrate those practices into their lives. We also have finally hired a person whose specialty, whose only focus is spiritual and emotional care. And we have a range of retreats that she and our volunteers have developed. We've used them on Zoom through COVID because people were just I don't even need to say how it's been. So that some of those were sort of presence retreats on Zoom that had journaling and centering and meditation and mindfulness and other the Ignatian practice of the daily examine, different things, depending on what the community seemed to be open to help leaders and their communities sort of develop their spiritual resiliency. So we have a kind of a range of those. We have a team that works with communities on those pieces. And we did some respite and resilience retreats for the first year of COVID. And then we met with a bunch of the regional leaders and said, how's that working for you and for your leaders? They're like, those have been good. We need something different now. We're not sure what it is. So that team met with a bunch of different people who had done some of the other retreats and with some of the like executive presbyters and whatnot, and said, okay, we're going to develop a different instrument now. So it's not a fixed product, it's an adaptive and kind of learning product. So We're also realizing that that a lot of the spiritual resilience tools we have work better in some communities than in others. And so we've been reaching out to our racial equity and women's intercultural ministry unit and to some of our indigenous neighbors to say, how could we, here's a piece that we have. We know that there are additional layers of trauma and layers of issues and location that happen in communities, and we'd like to be able to provide space for those to be addressed and support having those addressed. So we've also worked with some leaders in communities of color and indigenous communities to say this would help us and try to develop those. So it's a constant kind of let's build it and let's keep reviewing it and working on it. I just saw Harry come in, so I was afraid I was late for church, but apparently I'm okay. So other questions or thoughts or ideas for things that you think PDA or other offices at the National Church could do to come alongside congregations to help you be more effective in serving your community and more whole while you're doing it? We're always open to developing the way. We're very different now than we were when Bob and I started, aren't we? Very different now.
When I first heard your name, I thought, that's an odd name to have, just because public display of affection is what you think of with PDA. It's not a good thing.
But isn't it a good thing?
But now that I hear everything you've done, it's an excellent name.
Isn't it a great public display of affection? What you're doing with Guns to Gardens, what we're doing after trauma, what we're doing, in Cameroon and in Ukraine. Yeah, when they named us PDA, while Bob and I were both new volunteers, they kind of rebranded a bunch of the offices, and we were like, Presbyterian disaster assistance, really? And so they just said, well, no, people will catch on, it'll be fine. And people didn't catch on. So as soon as I came on staff, I just said, I'm just going to lean into it. Yes, it is a public display of affection. But thanks for clarifying, because when you said I first heard your name, I thought it was odd, and I was like, Laurie Kraus? Why is that odd? Thank you. This church really, you've supported in many specific arenas. Your leadership in the gun violence reduction movement is incredibly powerful, and we lift it up at the National Church. And just your solidarity with us in matching donations and in showing up for our appeals. There's hardly an appeal or a thing I've done in the last 10 years that I haven't eventually run across this church's name on my list of people to thank. And it's one of the reasons, this is, I think, the second time I've been here since you've been here. And one of the reasons I love to come to this church. It feels very like home to me. Your worship style and what you're engaged in is a lot like the congregation I served in Miami, and plus you're in New Mexico, which is always a gift and a blessing. So I really appreciate y'all, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you, Roy.